So now we're back for week number 3. This week, kind of continuing with a different thought, what I'm going to ask you to do is to read some documents where people protest about the American government, but really the kind of social and economic and political conditions that kind of give rise to them feeling like they have to. And so there's several different works that I'm going to ask you to read. And if you kind of look at this in the progression of the class, what we have is, so the first week we had kind of this notion of what the ideal of what the United States was actually supposed to be, and the American political dream, if you will, with the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address and the Constitution. What the United States means, at least in its most kind of abstract kind of form, its most ideal form. And so last week, second week, what we did is I had you read documents about people looking for some sort of expression of what it was that made them happy. And if you think about it, this week, which I'm asking to read about kind of political dissidents, it's really a combination of the first two, because oftentimes what will make people happy is the United States living up to what is actually supposed to represent. And this is true throughout, American history. And what's happened is I've picked out 4 documents for this week for you to look at to show kind of over time how these issues have kind of been raised, how they've been dealt with by different authors. And the first reading that I have for you is actually by Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Civil Disobedience. And last week I already had you look at Thoreau, and he dealt with Walden. He wrote the classic Walden, kind of his time in the woods, 2 years that he basically kind of condensed into the story, and kind of how he found that kind of living with nature and communing with nature and finding yourself is really what gave him kind of expression. This week, the document is different, and this was actually first published in kind of came out in 1846, and it's called Civil Disobedience, and is one of the classic kind of texts of what arguments for a limited government kind of stem from. He was what would be called a classical liberal. And what happens for Thoreau is he basically kind of, the Mexican-American War is going on at that point in time, and Mexican-American War, there's a poll tax at that same time, and the poll tax is actually to support that war. And Thoreau, in good conscience, cannot actually pay that poll tax, because he says this is really for the expansion of slavery, because if the United States ends up winning the Mexican-American War, what they're going to want to do is they're going to want to go to Texas and kind of extend slavery into those areas that they end up getting from Mexico. And he's like, this just isn't going to work. It's not something that I can support. And so he refuses to pay the poll tax. And quite frankly, he goes to jail. He only spends one night in jail. But what he does is he gives this argument that influenced, among other people in the 20th century, Gandhi from India and Martin Luther King Jr. From the United States, about what people need to do to protest the government, to protest kind of socioeconomic conditions that they cannot support. So that's one document. Civil Disobedience by Thoreau. The second document that I'm going to ask you to read is actually from a little bit later, still the 19th century, the 1800s, but the later part of the 1800s, and it was produced during the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age produced a greater separation in kind of social stratification than any other period in American history. That there was this huge gap between those people that were wealthy, so people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and kind of all these captains of industry that were known for the time, kind of during the Gilded Age, and the laborers, the people that were working. Excuse me. And what Gompers argues is that people need to start looking out for the interests of labor, that those people that are working day in, day out in these factories that are kind of running, producing this kind of great American industrial machine, their rights need to be protected, economically, socially, that there needs to be a voice for these people, that he starts speaking out against those vested interests that have the power, that have the money. And you've mentioned this kind of in your first discussion post, but a lot of you feel kind of discouraged that it seems like the United States only really speaks for business and for people that have power and that they have money. And this is what Gompers is saying too. And it's not surprising that the second greatest period of difference between the wealthy and kind of the poor, and kind of the squeezing out of the middle class, is today's age, the period that we're living in after the Gilded Age. So Gompers was dealing with kind of conditions that a lot of people kind of say are similar to now, and that separation between the wealthy and the poor. The third document that I asked you to look at is by a guy called Lincoln Steffens, and he wrote a work called Shame of the Cities. And Steffens was about a generation later than what Gomper's was. And Steffens was important because he was a muckraker. He was one of the people that Teddy Roosevelt said, kind of got out and dug in the muck, that they were trying to kind of expose this kind of corruption. And Roosevelt didn't use that necessarily as a positive term, but a lot of people took to that and said, yeah, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to expose kind of the underbelly, if you will, of kind of what is going on in the United States. And Steffens does that same thing in this work that's called The Shame of the Cities. And what he does is he actually tries to expose the kind of corruption that ties governments, city governments in particular, to business interests. And again, this is one of the things that you've commented on in your discussion post that you kind of think is going on now, that there's this kind of alliance, if you want to call it evil alliance, between business interests and between the government. So that's the third document. And the last document is actually by Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to ask you to read kind of this work, and then you'll have to read this again when we actually get to kind of African Americans and kind of issues that African Americans raise. But Martin Luther King in 1963 provided one of the most important and one of the most famous speeches of American history, which is the I Have a Dream speech. This work came out at the same time as that I Have a Dream speech, but it actually shows his much more kind of radical side, if you will. And this is a letter from Birmingham jail. It comes out in 1963, and King had been imprisoned in Birmingham, the jail in Birmingham, because of actually kind of, I think it was parading without a permit. And what he does is he talks about how people need to start giving voice to the things that they really care about. And he says that group that bothers him the most are moderates. He can understand hatred. He can understand people that are completely opposed to whatever agenda he might have had. But what he can't understand is these people that are basically just kind of middle of the road and say, wait, give it time. And he says, no, what we need action, and we need it now. And in some ways, this is one of King's kind of more radical kind of calls. And it's not that he's actually for violence. It's not that he goes against this notion that he has active kind of civil disobedience, but active kind of nonviolent civil disobedience. But it says people need to do something. When you see an injustice, you need to rise up and you need to basically kind of speak out against it. And in some ways, it's very similar to Thoreau that came before him. As I said, Thoreau's work came out in 1846 and King's work comes out in 1963. So there's really kind of this direct tie here. But all four of these works that I'm asking you to look at deal specifically with that notion that people see conditions that they need or that they believe need to be changed, and how they would argue that these conditions need to be changed, and that this is something that has happened throughout American history. So this is basically kind of the third week of what I would call our foundation. So as I said, the first week we looked at kind of what the promise and the hope of America really was supposed to be. Last week what we looked at is kind of that people tried to give expression to self, that they wanted to find something that meant something and gave themselves some sort of kind of identity, something that they could hold on to. This week is kind of this notion of political dissidents, that in holding on to those things that give them some sort of meaning, that they're actually arguing against the American government, and they're trying to say, look, this is what the American kind of idea, the American dream is supposed to be about. And so what we're going to do starting next week is we're actually going to look specifically at certain groups. So we'll look at African Americans, we'll look at Native Americans, we'll look at women, we'll kind of look at religious issues for our last 4 weeks. But hopefully you get something out of these readings. As always, if you have questions, you have concerns, let me know. My phone number is kind of in the syllabus. If you need to email me or text me, whatever the case might be, please do so. But as I said, hopefully you get something out of these documents. Kind of take a look at them. And until next week, I will be signing off. So see you then.